Welcome to the Secure Start podcast.
The world needs people who care about these kids and are finding their passion for how they can make a difference in their lives. Working in a place that is kind of the receptacle of last resort, I have been attentive to evidence to the contrary. Good, high-quality residential childcare is the best choice for a very small number of children in very specific circumstances. So even for kids who don't end up going back home or back to foster care, some of them go on to build a healthier, more rewarding family life in their adulthood as a result of the residential childcare experiences they've had. I think multiple placements is one of the most damaging things that care systems do to children and young people. But to be able to have breaks from each other as part of an alternative experience of care, I think is really valuable. Also having such a range of people with whom that child can have different kinds of connections, or there's at least one person there who can start to see like the beauty in that child. That Bronfenbrenner quote of at least one adult who's irrationally crazy about them. We're creating the conditions for children to experience themselves differently. Yep. And activities are about the best way to do that. Yep. Physical restraint is the most extreme form of physically containing. The research did, there were kids who talked about purposely orchestrating events such so they knew they would get restrained, to either let anger out or to be held while they cried. In the daily minutia of good care is where healing and developmental ground is regained.
Welcome to the Secure Start podcast. I'm Colby Pearce, and joining me for this episode is a highly experienced academic and researcher in therapeutic residential childcare. Before I introduce my guest, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that I'm coming to you from, the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains, and then acknowledge the continuing connection the living Kaurna people feel to land, waters, culture and community. I'd also like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. My guest this episode is Dr. Laura Steckley. Laura leads the MSc in Advanced Residential Childcare at the University of Strathclyde, and so has the very good fortune of teaching and learning with residential childcare practitioners. She has worked in direct and indirect practice in both the United States of America and Scotland. Her teaching, research and knowledge mobilisation are mostly addressed to residential childcare practice and education, with a particular focus on physical restraint. Welcome, Laura.
Thanks, Colby.
Now, I always like to ask people, was there anything else that you'd like to add to that short bio?
Yeah, I wanted to keep it short and snappy. I've done most of the kinds of work that you do in residential childcare, from like direct care, training, management, all of that, some of the bureaucratic admin stuff, and then came to teach and do research at the University of Strathclyde in 2003. So I started working in Resi in 1990. So I've been at it for quite a while.
Wow.
Hopefully there's a kind filter on the Zoom today. But yeah, I've been at it for a while. But it's still been my main focus and passion really as an adult, in my professional work from pretty much the start.
Yeah. And a concept that we concept or construct that we spoke about during a pre-meet a few weeks ago was that of pracademic. So
Yes.
you fit the profile in terms of having significant practice experience and having the good fortune to be able to research and further
Yeah.
study work
And I'm
in
interested in practice. Like that would be
yes.
another way of saying what my research and teaching interests are. And yeah, I'm really interested in practice. And I think it's a forever rich, complex, rewarding area to support, to study, to try and develop in terms of workforce in Scotland. And Scotland's been a good place to be doing that
Mm,
for sure.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, people will hear Scotland, and I did mention that you'd worked in the US as well, but you obviously don't have a Scottish accent.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
No, Scotland's been a good landing place for me. So I was already working in residential when I moved here, but I moved here in 1999. So I've been in Scotland for what is that then? In the beginning
26
of
years.
99, so that's 26 years. Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
as I just mentioned a little bit ago, Scotland has pretty high aspirations around care more generally, the alternative care, you might say, of
Mm,
children and young people, including residential childcare. And I suspect we'll be getting into some of the challenges around
mm,
that coming forward, but it's not perfect here.
yeah.
Most definitely not, but the aspiration is there, which has
Mm,
been a really good landing place for me. It
yeah,
felt like the stars aligned.
yeah. Yeah, speaking to other guests, it sounds very similar. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Okay.
residential childcare, tell us about how you came to be working in this really important but and at times controversial area of childcare practice.
Actually, before I answer that, I'm going to give a little anecdote. On the MSc in residential childcare, it's primarily managers, but some frontline practitioners. And because there's a big component of the use of self and who you bring to the encounter with the child, or who it is of yourself that you bring to the class, to the studies, we start the whole year with this activity called River of Life.
Mm,
And people choose what they want to share, but they chart what the key things that have happened in their life that brought them to this day where they're embarking on a master's level for some, like they haven't had good experiences of education in their whatever, but what's brought them to have that level of commitment to be working in residential childcare and to be doing this work, this educational work in relation to that. And for many years, well, we've been doing this for now 22 years, maybe it'll be this September. It's extremely rare, and most years no one says, I wanted to be a resi worker when I was a kid, right? And many people didn't even know what residential childcare was, myself included, or residential treatment, didn't know anything
mm,
about it. And like so many others, I fell into it almost accidentally. And this is a common theme across that,
mm,
and what that does to our workforce in terms of how it shapes professional identity,
mm.
which we may or may not get into. There's so much we could talk about today.
Yes.
But so I thought I was going to be a lawyer, thought I was going to be an
Mm,
attorney, and I like argument, not like hostile argument. I like building a strong argument from a young age, and I was interested in courtroom dramas as a kid. So I did an undergraduate degree, and in the United States, you do 4 years undergraduate and 3 years
mm,
law school. So I did my undergraduate degree focusing on what would get me into law school. And I did a degree in political science, or a major, as we call them, and I found it really just despairing, actually, the grimness of the political realities of the world, which are only getting worse, I think. But I also took an ethics class that I loved. And so that was in philosophy. And so I took another to get my humanities requirements out of the way, but I just kept taking more and more. And so I did a second major in philosophy.
Mm.
And I have to tell you, that equipped me more for residential childcare than any of the psychology I took, maybe because of the type of psychology that was being taught at my university. And when I finished the 4 years, I knew I wasn't mature enough to go to law school, like
Mm.
self-discipline and all that. And so I thought I need to just go be in the world and work. And a friend of mine had gotten a job in a residential treatment center. And she's like,
Mm.
we need staff, as you do. And she's like, maybe you'd be good at it. And so I'm like, I don't even know what that is. Like, so I went along and she had told me a bit about the work before I went. So I kind of thought about, what that might be like and how I might approach things. And I did well enough in the interview to get a job, although maybe they just needed a warm body. I don't know. And I swallowed the hook, man. It was so frightening and
Mm.
intense, but every day was different and it was meaningful. And I loved the teenagers. They were difficult and didn't always feel love for them, but overall, I loved working with teenagers. I loved working as part of a team, and it didn't take long before I realized the world didn't need another lawyer. But
Mm.
the world needs people who care about these kids and are finding their passion for how they can make a difference in their lives.
Yeah.
So that was the path for me
Mm.
into this work.
So
Yeah.
when you were working initially in residential childcare, um, cast your mind back. What influenced the way in which you went about the work? Would you say what were there people that had influenced you? Was there particular theories or bodies of work that you came across that were of influence to the way you went about being a residential childcare practitioner?
It was a bit more theoretical in the States. At least they espoused or claimed to follow. Positive peer culture was the first place I was in, and I learned about the power of the group, and that has
Mm.
influenced me ever since. And Scotland, maybe the UK more widely, is a bit afraid of the group, it feels like, afraid of groups of children,
Mm.
especially teenagers, and we don't harness. And we've also become much more individualized
Mm.
collectively, I think, at least in Western society since the early 1990s. So it's not just the UK probably. But yeah, so we struggle to harness the power of the group, I think, now. But it's still there, and I still kind of push against it. Ruth Eman's work, who would be another great person to have on the podcast, is brilliant. Um, for her PhD, she lived in a residential child's home as an adult. She didn't pretend she was a kid, but she also was very clear, I'm not a member of staff. I don't have keys. She had a bedroom, like the other kids had bedrooms, and did an ethnographic study of um, the children's culture
Mm.
outside of the staff gaze. She couldn't do it outside of the adult gaze because she's an adult, right?
Yeah.
And they tested her. You should get her on because she talks about how they tested her to see if she was going to like take things back to the staff, and she was really clear, like if it's serious imminent harm kind of stuff, I got to take that back, but
Mm.
otherwise, so they would test her and stuff. But she did a brilliant, and she's done brilliant work ever since then. So
Mm.
I'll talk more about her with you maybe after, but
Yeah.
anyway, so the power of the group, I think the other big thing was the move from the United States and a treatment focus, which was more deficit based,
Mm.
more medicalized orientation to the work that was so pervasive that I didn't recognize it as such because that's just how we all
Mm.
thought, and that was the wider culture. To residential childcare in Scotland, which felt sorely lacking in theory, not that we were actually using theory as well as we should have,
Mm.
but really understood care better than in the United States. And
Mm.
I think care is the way to go. Not that there isn't a place for a treatment orientation, but
Mm.
I think it's where in the daily minutia of good care is where healing and developmental ground is regained, and
Mm.
I and that relationship within which that care takes place, and those relationships I
Mm,
think that's probably the most significant. And then there's been theorists around that,
mm,
both in relation to residential childcare and social work, but also care ethics and, um, yeah, in terms of how we constitute society. Even Joan Toronto's work as a political
mm.
philosopher about the marginalization care and the fact that we need to bring it to the center of society's concerns
Yeah,
all have played a big part. And that's just a little bit.
a little bit.
Yeah, I
I
read a lot.
when you were talking about the difference between what happened in the US and what you were observing in Scotland, it made me think about treatment as being something that you do too, and care as being something that you do with.
Yeah. If you're doing good care, yes.
Yeah.
And we didn't always. Even
Mm,
once I got to Scotland in '99, and I didn't get a job for about 6 months. I think when I had submitted applications and even did an interview, they were like, I'm not sure about her, because I was coming from such a different orientation. But a place took a chance on me, um, and I worked then in Scotland in care
mm,
for a few years, four
mm.
years, something like that, before then going on to work at the university. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. And I recall from our conversation during our pre-meet that you have some things to say about what children say about their experiences in residential care. I wonder if you'd be happy to share some of that.
Sure. So, yeah. So, in both the United States and in Scotland, and I'm aware from the literature, many places in the world, residential childcare is very much treated as a last resort.
Mm,
And there's this underlying belief that sometimes not even adults are not even aware of, or that they don't scrutinize if they are aware of it, that like that's the worst thing for a child.
mm,
And so, working in a place that is kind of the receptacle of last resort, I have been a- attentive to evidence to the contrary, and there have been some interesting studies, none of which that I'm aware of have focused in on which is better and under what circumstances.
mm,
And maybe I'll put my cards on the table to use a poker metaphor. I believe residential childcare is the best, good, high quality residential childcare is the best choice for a very small number of children in very specific circumstances.
mm,
And so in 1998, Berridge and Brody did a really significant study, and that wasn't their focus, but that was kind of, and that's how it seems to be coming through in the research. That was kind
mm,
of a side thing that they included Jim Anglin, who's a North American. His seminal grounded theory study has a batch of, and what's happening in these studies is kids who've experienced both foster care and
mm,
residential childcare have had things to say, and often it's been a majority have had a preference for residential childcare.
mm,
Duncalf in the UK is a care leaver herself, and she did a big a big questionnaire type study, and quite a lot of people responding had had experience of both, and a high proportion preferred residential childcare to nearly half experienced the placement is very positive, and 78% preferred residential childcare, and 5% indicated they preferred foster care.
Why do you
And that
think that
really,
is
yeah.
why do you think that is the case?
There's more recent ones, but I'm less on top of them anyway. So I think, again, if it's the right child, if it's good quality residential childcare and it's the right child
Mm,
circumstances, certainly the pressure of the more intimate familial relational demands that we naturally make of one another as part of being in relationship with one another would be experienced by some children in a foster home as even potentially intolerable because of the loyalties or ambivalence they loyalties to their family of origin, or their ambivalence about these kind of relationships because of the damaging experiences they might have had in similar type of relationships that haven't yet been
Mm.
cognitively processed, digested. Um, and so that's, I think, why foster care goes wrong a lot. I also think foster carers are often put in horrible
Yeah.
situations,
Yeah.
as well. And I think we do damage to adults with this, as well as damage to
Mm.
kids by placing them on for ideological reasons
Hmm.
that foster care is better because it
Family.
mimics
Mm.
family more. But
Mm.
I think residential childcare has more resources, even though it's poorly resourced in most countries, has more
Mm.
resources just in the sheer number of adults. And if there's a good culture, or there's good training and ongoing as well as entry level training, then I think, as well as just like activities, the power of the group, all of that kind of stuff. And sometimes it can be a bridge back to either family of origin or back to, and I've worked with kids where we provided bridging experiences, which Anglin, I don't know if he coined the term, but uses that very well in his seminal study. Experiences that then enable them to access the kind of normal experiences of either going back to their family or of origin, and or foster family, and being able to have more normal family life.
Mm.
Um, but I don't think there's enough recognition of what some kids need to be able to do that. And then there are other kids who either aren't able or don't want to have that as part of their childhood. They might go on to have that in adulthood. I've had a student who looked at outcomes of the placement that he had worked in, but these people were in their late 20s and early 30s. And one of the most significant outcomes that they identified, this whole dialogue around, or yeah, the whole way we use outcomes, they were defining outcomes themselves, which was a really powerful but small study. And they said, I parent my children differently because of the way that I experienced relationships with the adults in this home. And the reparenting, they didn't call it that, as compared to how my parents parented me. Like, so so even for kids who don't end up going back home or back to foster care, some of them go on to build a healthier, more rewarding family life in their adulthood as a result of the residential childcare experiences they've had. We have some small bits of evidence from small scale study and anecdotal evidence as well. And the reason why we don't have more evidence is because we're not designing research that's asking the right questions, and that's
Mm.
a funding issue. But
Yeah.
anyway,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
I'm not good at short answers. Sorry.
No, no, that's okay. It has often been said of me as well. I can write succinctly. When I used to do a lot of court work, I had a bit of a reputation for giving long answers, but amongst the lawyers, that is. Um,
I'm glad I'm with a kindred then.
yeah, yeah. So, yeah, you said a couple of things there of interest to me. I've long also felt that there are young people who find being in a family, young people in the out-of-home care system who find being in a family um, emotionally unsafe and threatening. They do, they just, the level of closeness that we expect of people. And um, and it's tragic to think that they might go through any number of family-based foster placements before at some stage someone decides, well, they're not really getting on at all in foster care, so we'll have to invoke the option of last resort, as you say. Um, Whereas if you actually thought about the experience of the young person, so rather than making an ideological decision that the best place for children to grow up is in a family environment, and that's a general ideology, as you say, if you actually just treated each child on a case by case basis and thought about the particular characteristics of each child and what their needs might be, there are likely to be a proportion of young people that you would, from the outset, choose residential care for.
Yep.
And what I also heard you say, and see, I often think of the impact of relational trauma as being like a phobia. And what's the best treatment for phobias? Graded exposure.
Yeah.
The thing that they're phobic of is relational closeness.
And so we
They've been
put them in
hurt.
situations
Yeah,
where it's too intense, too
yeah,
fast, and
yeah.
we actually deepen the phobia or we deepen the
That's what we
hurt.
do.
And I think multiple placements is one of the most damaging things that
Mm,
care systems do to children and young people.
yeah,
Yeah, we're totally in agreement about this. I would add, for that to be possible, though, people who are making placement decisions need to understand what residential childcare can offer, understand
mm,
what can happen or what does happen in good residential childcare, and then residential childcare needs to be supported to do what it
yeah,
can do so well.
yeah,
And
yeah.
those two things are really precarious at best when
Mm,
both of those things are kind of functioning, but often people have no idea.
mm,
And so all they have is that ideological thing to fall back on because they
yeah,
just don't know.
yeah.
Yeah.
I,
Yeah.
yeah, I am concerned that if we maintain the idea that residential care is the care option of last resort, then it's difficult for me to conceive of that policymakers would fund it well.
Yeah, exactly. So it's this vicious circle or self-fulfilling
Yeah.
prophecy. Like it's and
Yeah.
yet and this is why in Scotland it's a good place to be because the current Scottish government does have an investment. It can't
Mm,
back up that investment with the kind of resources that are actually required, or it I mean, there's
mm,
always money, but who has the money? Like, it's not like they're swimming in it.
mm.
They have it, they have to make decisions. And I certainly don't think residential childcare is the only thing deserving of resources, right? So I wouldn't want to have to be the person making those kind of budgetary decisions. But there is that aspiration in the Scottish government. There is an awareness of residential childcare and of care more generally. This has been one of the great things about living in Scotland, especially as compared to the United States, is the Scottish government and Scotland is small enough that policymakers do really listen and you have access. I'm part of CELSIS and the Department of Social Work and Social Policy, and CELSIS has changed its name, so it's no longer the Center of Excellence for Looked After Children, but I can't remember the exact bits now. But CELSIS is one of the many ways that Scottish government communicates, and then I'm part of CELSIS, and so I watched the Children's Act get influenced by care experienced activists, and CELSIS was a bit a part of that in the background. Um, and that activism informed some of what came out of the Children's Act 2013, I think, such that children's age of leaving care got extended to 21 with support of through care to 26. And there was a
Mm.
very much relational face-to-face impact between the then head Nicola Sturgeon of the Scottish government and care experienced people that, and the promise also came out of all of that
Yeah.
too.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Mm.
yeah. Small is better sometimes.
Yeah, I think so. And you also mentioned before about children going back to birth family, and you mentioned bridging and spoke about James Anglin. There's a name I'd like to get on my podcast as well.
Oh yeah, wouldn't that be great?
So we talked a little bit about how residential care, if you think about trauma creating a phobia where the phobic object is relational connection. That's where children feel most unsafe, and the best treatment for that is graded exposure. So you gradually re-expose them to relational connection. With birth family connection, often think that residential care has the opportunity to lead the way in terms of birth family reconnection because there's less agendas when you've got a
Yeah.
professional workforce working with children. It's much more vexed if it's family-based care, if it's foster care, or if it's kin as well, where
Yeah, yeah.
oftentimes the kinship carers are quite negative in their position, their disposition towards the parent on the other side of the family, so to speak. But even foster carers can be very unforgiving of birth parents. So I think birth family reconnection, I think, um, is something that residential childcare can lead the way. And I guess this kind of leads me into wondering about what else you've discovered about how residential childcare can offer things. Better things or offer things in a better way than other forms of out of home care.
Well, right on that point that you're making, I think sometimes the care that they give to families as well, and helping families make sense of their child's behavior, for example, creating spaces where children and their family members can start to have that graduated kind of reconnection. And I think, often it's less threatening for the family too, that these,
Yeah.
especially if there's a school on site, then, oh, my child's at school and they're just the staff at the school. I think that makes it even easier. But even in a care home, or they refer to them as houses in a lot of places here, because of the negative stigma attached to care home.
Mm.
But so in houses here, like it's still a house that is kind of professional versus the foster cares or kinship cares. So yeah, I definitely think there's that. I think I think the power of the group, as I've mentioned,
Mm.
um, having I can remember being able to endure and actually be really present and really tolerant and creative and bear quite a lot of rage or difficulty, sometimes into 3 or 4 in the morning,
Mm.
having worked a double, having started the morning before, whatever, or just the energy of like camping and like many days, because I knew I was going to go home and go, right? And so I think there's something about, and for kids too, to have a fresh face, like with all the shame. I think shame's a part. So I think there's phobia, but I think shame's an
Hmm.
interesting part. And we talked about that earlier, and I haven't read the thing you sent me. I just remembered. But but to be able to have breaks from each other as
Hmm.
part of an alternative experience of care, I think is really valuable. That's just not structurally possible in a foster home
No.
or in kinship care. I mean, the break is from the family of origin, and sometimes there's toing and froing that happens there that can be helpful,
Hmm.
but often isn't. So, yeah, I think there's that. And also having such a range of people with whom that child can have different kinds of connections, or there's at least one person there who can start to see like the beauty in that child.
Yeah.
That Bronfenbrenner quote of at least one adult who's irrationally crazy about them. And for some kids, what's happened to them and their way of coping and defending themselves has become you know, such a rejection of the world and ways of please reject me, kind of to keep you away from me, that it can be really hard to see that child's beauty or wonderfulness in whatever form that it manifests. And you have a large enough group of people, and once that starts, then that can spread to other people. And so while we all sometimes have to try to look for it and have to pretend isn't the right word, but when it's difficult, you kind of have to shift to where there's this really genuine, authentic reflecting back a child's goodness to him. The bigger and we all need that experience in our
Yeah.
lives, not just as children, but we need a lot of it as children. And then if you've had really hurtful experiences, you need more of that. And I I think that's something that isn't really talked about, but I was very aware of it in practice when I had those moments where that happened and I was able to do it. It sort of just happened at first, and then I became aware of it and was able to do it. And I think like that would be an example of like people who don't understand residential childcare wouldn't even be able to muster that up. But that happens within good teams, and really good teams who are cooking on gas, they talk about it. And like who is connecting with this kid just now, who is able to reflect back to this kid his goodness. It's probably not happening all over, but
There's so much in what you say. I mean, it puts me in mind of my own observation across 30 years of practice in child protection, out of home care, and related endeavours, which is that our children don't just. I often think about the one good adult research, and I think
yeah,
yes. Absolutely. We need to have, as Yuri Bronfenbrenner said, you have to
yeah,
have one of those adults in your life. And but but I do think um, the more good relationships
yeah,
that children have, the better. So I think, our child protection systems very much focus on, well, you've had a bad experience with parents here. So what we're going to do is line you up with some new parents, and you'll have experiences with them that will um, that will remediate, that will
yeah,
repair the
yeah,
damage that is done there. And you mentioned earlier about how foster carers often get um, hurt themselves through in this system, and largely that's because, from my point of view, they're sold a bit of a dummy, really, about what is possible,
yeah.
what can be achieved.
And
The
what will be
reality,
demanded of them?
yeah, the reality is that it just there's so much more that needs to happen um, to help a child or young person recover from that early relational adversity.
Yeah.
I'm not particularly au fait with the power of the group that when yeah, and I wondered if you might just say a few words about that and what you mean for my
Okay.
benefit, if not, other listeners as well.
Okay. Gosh, where to begin? I think I'll start by saying, like, anytime you have a group of people, or even just two people, and probably intrapersonally as well, there's always dynamics that are happening within a group. And I think being able to channel some of that is useful. But I also think so. My first experience was with a model called positive peer culture.
Mhm.
So, and this is about the power of peer relationships to foster positive change. So much so that, like, we were encouraged and sometimes even corrected to, if we didn't do this, instead of like directly confronting a kid's behavior, you would sidle up to a different kid and say, I'm interested in the fact that you're noticing so and so struggling with this authority problem and you haven't yet called a group. And the whole day, even in education, like if something was happening, any child could call a group or adult could call a group, but ideally you want the kids calling group. And then they stand up and they circle up and they're like, I'm calling this group, Colby, because I see that you're struggling with your authority problem with Mrs. Smith, and I think we can help you with that. And there's this whole list of problems that on the one hand is good because it gives kids a way to identify things and a language for it. It's pretty deficit based because it's all problem based,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
and then they talk and they swear at each other and they follow, but and these kids were so insightful and they would listen to each other in a way that they didn't listen to adults, right? So there's that, like, and that happens anyway. I mean, that was a very structured, facilitative approach that was sometimes amazing and sometimes it felt a bit dodgy. Yeah, because there was no required qualification for us to be doing that. And
no.
like the power of that, you really had to be good at it and you had to have an understanding and a value base because yeah, you could use a book group to bully a kid, for example, a kid
Mm.
who's given you problems or whatever. So there was all that. Plus, I would say, and I'm going to draw on Jack Phelan. He'd be another great person to have, by the way. He wrote this really small article a while back, and he's now got a book out that I haven't read yet, but is on my list. But this little nugget was this thing called experience arranging. And he was like, child and youth care work isn't all the things we think it is. It's experience arranging. That's what we're doing. We're creating the conditions for children to experience themselves differently,
Yep.
and activities are about the best way to do that.
Yep.
Because, and now I'm going to extrapolate and add my little bit, because especially if the activity is fun enough or engrossing
Hmm.
enough, then it drowns out that background narrative of I'm a bad kid, or I'm too cool for this, or all of the stuff that gets kids in the way of being able to experience, say, the restorative foster parents that you mentioned before. Um, so group activities, if, and again, it requires skill and fortitude to do well, can really enable children. And like for my master's dissertation, which was the school football team that played against other special schools, and the way these boys, some of them had already got aged out, as we used to call it, the way they talked about those transformative experiences of the school football team, and they never at that time would have been able to access a normal mainstream school or league, football team because of the behavioral difficulties, was like life changing for them. And they could have that as part of a group, and like they could remember, Colby, like, remember that game where we played against and they named the other school, and I was coming down the line, and like this was a few years prior,
Mm.
and then he just knew I was going to pass it to him, and he was right there, and blah, 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 and the excitement and everything, it was just amazing. So I guess that is what I mean about the power of the group. And for a lot of our kids, they don't have the normal experiences of group that
Mm.
kids, which I think is reducing for all kids right now, to be honest
Yeah.
with you.
Yeah.
Um, Sports and band and all of that, the
Mm.
funding for all of that is not good. But yeah, that's what I mean.
Yeah, thank you. That's a wonderful description, and it put me in mind of sports teams. Yeah, as you were
Mhm.
talking about it, and then so it was nice that you finished up with giving a sports um, example. But and I love what you're saying, what you're attributing to Phelan. I totally, you will never talk a child out of believing that they're bad.
Yeah,
You'll
they
never
have to
talk them out of
experience
it. They
themselves.
have to experience themselves in a different way. They also,
Yeah,
you'll never talk them into trusting people
right. They
until
have to
they can, until
experience.
they have the experience that
And
they
it's
can
the
trust
minutia
people.
of care, of
Yeah,
really good care, the little
that's right.
drip drips of care, that's where the restoration happens. Not that the therapy hour doesn't have its place, but yeah,
Mm.
yeah, we're
Yeah, recent
kindreds.
guest. Yeah, recent guest was Adela Holmes. Who set up Hurstbridge Farm, a residential therapeutic community here in Australia. She was talking about getting what comes first, the cart or the horse, and in this sense that we often expect children to behave, and as a reward for that, we will give them good relationship.
Yes, yes.
Yeah,
And it's
and
outrageous, isn't it?
And it has to be the other way around. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Now, I want to, people are going to wonder a bit about this little segue. Your research interest has been in restraint. One of your great, I know this. I don't know. I'm not sure if you've mentioned it already, but one of your great theoretical passions is containment theory. Containment and restraint.
Yeah. Yeah, so I can remember because I did have to restrain children, young people. Really, I've mostly worked with young people. I remember like something is going on here that is powerful, and I don't understand what it is, and I need ways of understanding this. And it really troubled me. Like, and
Mm.
I became the in-house trainer in one of the places in Colorado for crisis, for, restraint and all of the stuff that went around trying to avoid getting into restraint. Um, and so physical restraint, for anybody who's watching that doesn't know exactly about residential childcare and physical restraint, it doesn't just happen in residential childcare. It happens across a lot of strata of society. But in residential childcare, if a child poses serious imminent harm to themselves or someone else, um, and the adults responding have no other way of making it safe, they sometimes have to hold a child against his or her will, and it can be really horrible for everybody.
Mm.
And people can get really hurt. And so I did a study in 2000. It probably started in 2003, and it went on for a long time, partly because I collected so much data. I had to do justice to all of that. So I published from that data for a really long time, and it took a good few years to collect the data around people's experiences of restraint. And I also then came to be aware of containment theory as a way of, first, of a way of understanding what was happening in the data, what I had experienced, as a way of understanding what people were saying about their experiences, adults and young people and children. Um, and then containment theory just has become an organizing frame, a way of seeing the world generally for me. It's not the only way, but it is a big one. And of seeing residential childcare practice more widely. So I've done some other research in relation to physical restraint, and it's recently been announced, so I can say here that the Scottish Government is funding a 30-month project that I'm a part of, leading up, around mainly research, but also some knowledge mobilization. And it's not just we research and then we give the knowledge. Like, we're mobilizing knowledge from the residential childcare sector while at the same time giving knowledge back. So there's this
Mm.
flow of knowledge between us that's being mobilized in the best interests of children, young people, around reducing, where possible, eliminating restraint. But here's the other thing, and again, I'll put my cards on the table, but also ensuring that when, not ensuring, because we can't, raising the likelihood to the greatest extent possible that when restraints do happen, they are experienced as an act of care and protection by the child or young person. And actually, that first study, there were children and young people who said some restraint. So I asked a question like, how did the restraint affect your relationship with the people who restrained you? And and then adults, how did it affect your relationship with the kid that you restrained? And adults all said either it damages it or they're kind of neutral about it. Um, but children, young people, over a third said in some cases it improved the relationship. And when I was doing the interviews both at the same time. I didn't do like children first and then adults or vice versa. So I started asking adults, once they had exhausted what they wanted to tell me, what about the other side of the coin? Is there ever a time that it's had a positive effect? And a really high proportion, once given the question and maybe some permission, were, well, with some kids, like there's a relief, or, so
To be
I think when
contained.
kids are at their most extreme
Mm.
states of distress, rage, um, all of the things that happen in the lead up to a restraint, can be understood. And now I'm going to shift to containment theory. So I'm going to give the very boiled down version. So containment theory is really about what makes the unmanageable, unbearable, intolerable, uncontainable, containable, manageable, bearable, tolerable. And that, like, that's the way in, that's the boil down. And most people can recognize states of being uncontained, and that's another way in. So if you've ever yourself been such strong feelings that you can't think straight, um, then that would be an example of being uncontained. And Bion, who's the father of containment theory, um, so it's actually a developmental theory that we develop the capacity. Now, here's the other little boiled down way in to use thinking to manage raw experience and emotion, right?
Mm.
So to be able to use thinking to make it containable, manageable. Um, and we all have moments or periods of time, individually and groups have this, where we lose that, or
Mm.
where it's lost a bit and we're not thinking very clearly as a team and we become punitive, or there's lots of ways we can um, identify this in our own lives. And so physical restraint is the most extreme form of containing, physically containing. But if there is all the other things, that the relational part, it's handled as in the most child-centered way possible up to and during the restraint and then post the restraint, then it may also be like therapeutically containing. And that also came through in the data. So we're containment theory will be very much a part of the study that's about to start. It's more than a study because it's also got some knowledge mobilization in it. But there will be other elements to that as well. But certainly, there are a lot of things that happen for kids that are uncontainable, right? But also for the adults. So if adults are going to be able to Brian also talked about like the mother absorbs the child's uncontainable empty stomach, or just dysregulation. We'll use
Mm.
dysregulation because that's identifiable. For Brian, it was the mother would absorb that and give it back in a more containable form. The clean nappy, the full stomach, the rocking. And there is something very physical, I think, about our needs for containment that's very challenging. So staff do their version of absorbing it and then giving it back in a more manageable form, which could be something as simple as, you seem really upset about that.
Mm.
Let's go for a walk. Like that there's a bit of containment in there. And but they need contain because there's a lot of things that happen in the work that raise anxiety that are hard to manage, that things that are frightening or concerning, or and not just the children's behavior, but the fact that you work in a field that's last resort and stigma that can go with that, organizational policies and practices that aren't so helpful. There's all sorts of things that can cause scandals and history of institutional abuse. All of that stuff can, in a very unconscious way, create anxiety that then compromise adults' ability to be good containers for kids through
Mm.
their relationships. If we can help that, and if that containment gets stronger, that therapeutic relational containment and the rhythms and routines and positive symbolism and all that stuff, symbolic communication, then I truly believe, and there's some anecdotal evidence, and another project I'm a part of is beginning to produce other kinds of evidence that it can reduce restraints through, because that stuff is being contained earlier in whatever process of escalation might have occurred, that sort of
Mm.
thing.
Mm.
So that is a very messy attempt to offer an introduction to like what the two are and what they have to do with each other. Yeah,
Thank
we'll
you.
we'll start there, or we could even end there. When I first started getting excited about containment theory, I kind of felt like I was not a sole voice, but one of a very few voices, and banging on about this, and I knew that most people were hearing something different than what I was intending
Like
because of
restrictive practices. Yeah.
exactly of the negative connotation. And I'm like, well, holding environments, Winnicott's holding environments is kindred. Like they're very, and Beyond's containment, they're very, very close.
Mm.
And I often use the two almost interchangeably.
Mm.
But holding therapies, especially like the attachment holding therapies that Foster Klein was doing in the United States, I just didn't want that to get conflated because that's very
Mm.
contentious work that kids were deliberately provoked and then held. And
For
because I was
hours.
linking it with yeah, with physical restraint, I thought I can't go that
Mm,
way. So I just
mm,
kept banging on about it. And I have to say in Scotland, containment theory is getting traction. It's becoming part of people's vocabulary in a way that is useful in helping them understand their own needs to be able to meet the needs of children. It's not uniform across the whole country or anything, but it is definitely getting
mm,
traction. And it's exciting when students like are like, oh, like anything that has explanatory power. And people are like, oh,
mm.
this helps me make sense of stuff. And then they start using it in very enthusiastic ways. We're
Yeah.
seeing that, and that's
Mm.
been very rewarding for sure.
Yeah, previous podcast guest Lisa Etherson has she's the person I was telling you about who has developed shame containment theory.
Yes, yes,
Um,
that's a thing I need to read that you sent me.
yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah, yeah.
yeah. Read it. It is. It's very interesting. I hope to have her back on shortly. You know,
Before
the
we
other.
move on from that, sorry,
Yep.
just it just occurs to me that shame is probably the most uncontainable emotion. And so I immediately can see a link there. Like shame is so intolerable of all of our emotions that we usually shift it into rage or we shut down. And so and part of containment theory is about making the unthinkable
Bearable.
thinkable
Mm,
and the unfeelable feelable. And so, and I think shame is one of the most important unacknowledged, unaddressed aspects of what's going on in practice. So, from my practice interest, um, one of the projects I'm working on, we're beginning to look at shame and how we can make that more recognizable and dealable with.
yeah.
So the fact that she's linked that with containment actually sparked something
Mm,
for me in a way that when we talked about it before, it hadn't it hadn't
mm.
set legs in. So yeah, that's really interesting.
What you
Sorry.
said, what you said could have came out of Lisa's mouth. Then I think,
Really?
yeah,
Okay.
based on my experience of listening to Lisa talk about it, yeah, absolutely,
Okay.
that it does get
Cool.
shifted into rage, and you then do think about some of our, our significant social problems in
Yes.
society that are anger and rage based, and the importance of for me, the importance of understanding where that comes from. I think it's probably
Totally.
just misattributed to um, as just being to do with toxic masculinity, for
Yeah.
example, or one's own cultural factors around male aggression and so
Yeah.
on. When male aggression, a significant component of it, for example, is this uncontained,
Shame.
can be uncontained shame related to that.
Yeah.
And until
And
we
the
get to grips with
relationship.
that, yeah, until we
Yeah.
get grips with it, we won't fully get we won't get as far with dealing with some of those social ills that revolve around male aggression in particular
Yeah.
than we
And
might otherwise.
understanding it, yeah, understanding it isn't justifying it in any way. Understanding it can lead us to better solutions,
Yeah, yeah,
and it's in everybody's interest. The other thing about containment doesn't just make it go away. And so like the previous ways that term has been used, I think there isn't much thought about what happens after you contain it, like that's it
mm,
done. And containment, so like if you are having hugely anxiety provoking things happening at work and you have a really good containing supervision, you don't come out of that supervision with your anxiety taken away. You come out of that supervision with greater clarity of thinking. You come out of that supervision with a greater sense that you can manage what previously felt more unmanageable, and you come out of that supervision maybe with a bit more hope and things that you can do. And so, yeah, I think
mm,
that that's the other thing I wanted to say about containment theory. It doesn't make it go away. It just shifts it to something more manageable, clear thinking, all that kind of stuff. But boy, don't we need that in
mm,
society
mm.
or after a really difficult shift, the whole
And
range.
Yeah, and super. I love what you said a little bit earlier when you were talking about it, about the need for staff to be contained. And
Yeah,
it's been a consistent theme that's come up in this podcast over the past 19 guests that I've had on, most of them talking about the need for a containing supervision arrangement
yeah,
in order
yeah,
to, yeah, yeah.
yeah,
The other thing I just talking about um, restraint and the some children, I can, looking back at my own practice over the past 30 years, I can easily think of um, the kids who actually sought out physical contact, sought out touch, because we part of safe care and safe care practice in out of home care, not just, I guess, in therapeutic residential childcare, but in foster and kinship care, has perhaps led us away from the role of touch, the
yeah.
role the
And
role
holding even,
and of holding, and we have children who haven't been held
right?
for
Physically,
years, physically
yeah,
held for years and
yeah.
years, and we
And not
know.
everybody. Sorry, I'm getting excited.
No, that's okay. I was just going to say, yeah, 1995 was I had a paper published in the Journal of the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry about the importance of physical touch on mental health and
Yeah,
well-being. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. You know, not everybody needs held when they're at their most uncontained or when they're uncontained generally, but a lot of us do, and a lot of kids do. You add to that, though, that being touched and held, all like you might need it, but you also need for it not to
Mhm.
happen, or you're, whether it's phobic or what meaning it has for you after people have um, been exploitative around that or hurtful around that. So that's this whole nother layer of further anxiety that staff are undergoing. And the research did, um, there were kids who talked about purposely um, orchestrating events such so they knew they would get restrained to either let anger out or to be held while they cried. They were a minority, but it's still significant. And or witnessing that and thinking that's what was happening for another kid. And there are people who have really had a problem with that being in my findings, or with kids having anything positive to say about it, like
Mm,
the positive impacts on relationship being in my
yeah.
findings. And I think you got to create a space for all of people's truths to come forth and then try to make sense of that truth in a way that doesn't distort it. Yeah, but here's the other thing is catharsis. Like our bodies have a somatic reaction to the emotional dimension, and we haven't really dealt with the fact that a child's body will have needs during that, not just this abstract emotional need dealt through talking, but adults as well. And so, what's going on there that we might be brave, but also really careful about to try to better meet kids' needs. So, again, so that
Mm,
either restraints aren't needed or when they do happen, it's experienced as an act of care and protection. Do you know? And I think the thing I've become very interested in very recently is that attunement. So that attunement and the ability to reflect back what you're tuning in on when you're in that escalating phase, maybe going up to a restraint. Like how capable are most people of doing that when actually they're either shutting down or having to manage their natural desire to either shut down or their natural defense or to shift to rage or whatever it is that's happening for them, but to actually be there for the child and be attuned to that child. And yet, I think that might be emotional availability and attunement in those peak moments are the hardest thing, but maybe the most powerful thing to avoid it
mm,
going to the kind of brutalizing restraint that kids have described in
yeah.
my research and in many other places, other research and the promise and that sort of
Mm.
thing.
You,
Boy, that's advanced practice. isn't it?
Mm, mm. You know, Laura, there is so much we could talk about,
I know,
even
I'm
in
sorry.
just what you were saying then. Um, a couple of things though that I reflect, a couple of my own reflections on that, and it goes back to what you were saying right at the beginning of this talk, which is that for certain children, resident residential care is the best option for certain children. It aligns with their needs. But in order, and then at that time I reflected, um, you reflected and I reflected too, that we need to get away from these kind of ideological approaches to the care of the children and actually understand what each child actually needs.
Yeah,
Yeah. And similarly, you're not saying that restraint is a good far from it. You're not saying that restraint is a good experience for all children, but there
no,
are children who will seek out that physical contact, that physical containment,
yeah.
um, um, because it meets
And we
it
got to
meets a
know how to,
need for them.
yeah, and we have to figure out how to deal with that, or we'll do much greater damage to those kids, even though they're a
Yeah.
small minority. They
Mm.
matter, and people aren't making that up.
No, and we need to. So again, I mean, one of I think the broad messages of this conversation has been that we need to understand our subject more and
Yeah,
more. And
yeah,
and it's through understanding our subject that we can tailor our responses better and more
yeah.
therapeutically to them.
Yep. When I first started working in that first residential treatment center, I knew very quickly I did not know enough to
Mm,
be doing that work. And I didn't get the sense that people around about me knew enough either. Like,
yeah,
yeah. And now I feel that even more. So, do you know, like the more you don't know kind of thing. And it's such complex work. It's
yeah,
such complex work.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I better let you go. You've got your
Okay.
day ahead of you. I've got my evening ahead of me. But one last thing, I would love to to you again, and I would love to speak about the topic of attunement. And
Yeah, me too. Let's
And
do that.
I thought I would just leave you with one thought, one reflection. You know the still face experiments. You're
Yes.
familiar with, yeah? And there's the
Yeah.
famous there's kind of like a famous video that you can lift off of the
Yes, I
internet
use
of
it in
it.
my teaching.
Yeah, 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 yeah. So at where it's one of the authors of it. He's kind of narrating the
Yes.
video. You know the
Yes.
one? Yeah, I mean
Yes, and I
everyone
can't think of
would
his
use it.
name.
No, I'm
Yeah.
having a mental blank. Now, everyone when I because I use it in my training as well. I get people to I've warned people it's very distressing, blah de blah. But what I want you to do is notice what is the mum's first response to the baby. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that what when she comes out of still face.
Yeah.
So if people don't know what we're talking about, you can go if you go onto YouTube and do and type in still face experiment, you're likely to get the
I
video
get
we're
it.
talking
Yeah.
about. Anyway, so mum's playing and interacting with her child and they're in sync. They're attuned to
Yes.
each other. And then mum
Yes.
looks away, as you know, and she looks back and she's
Still face.
still faced. Now, this was advice that was doled out, and maybe still is that, when a child is escalating, what you should do is
Totally.
is
Totally.
is is just be give them no emotional reaction at all.
Yes.
Now, the
And
still
that
face experiment,
probably has caused some restraints, even
yeah,
in my own practice. And, and some people then maybe even become more wooden as part of their coping because they don't want counter aggression to be coming through, or they naturally shut down when they're feeling threatened, right?
yeah,
And at those moments, that child becomes, we are so much on the same wavelength with this because teach about this in my, and that child is like, I need you, and reaching for that baby, right? And the baby becomes completely uncontained, so
Yeah.
much so that she loses her physical posture. She even
Mm,
becomes uncontained physically. And that and then you could link it with shame too, in terms of like being cast out, and
mm,
like the deep fundamental like sociological understanding of shame, and that a relational repair, or the minute the, because you said that what does the mom do as soon as she's allowed to come out of still face, it's that relational repair or that connection that she immediately connects to that child. So if we can stay connected to that child during that escalation, we may have a much better chance of it, of that child not becoming more uncontained, rather than, and our uncontainment may look different as we become more wooden, trying to be professional. And
mm.
certainly when I started working in the field, it was like
Yeah.
being professional meant being detached,
Mhm.
especially in provocative situations. Whereas it
Mm.
actually might help to say, God, I'm really frustrated right now and I don't know how to help you. Right?
Absolutely. So
Yeah.
the child will be, when you give them nothing, they will escalate because they're looking for
Yeah.
you to feel what you that they feel. They're
Exactly.
looking for attunement, and you give
Yeah.
them nothing, and they just keep escalating. And the
Totally.
poor baby in the still face, she's just escalating. But then I think about mum. What's
Yeah.
mum likely to be thinking at that time? So
Yeah.
mum's, as you watch it and it gets closer to when she can come out of still face, she just starts blinking really rapidly.
Does she?
She does. She
Oh,
blinks a
nice
lot,
observation.
and then she comes out, and I say to everyone in my in the talks that I give, what's the first mum's first reaction? And they say she's happy. And so I play it back and I play it again. And her first reaction is, well, it starts with the blinking of the eyes before she even comes out of, and her first one reaction as she comes out is, "Oh,
Oh,
my
yeah, yeah,
baby, there you
yeah,
are. Ah,
yeah.
mummy's here. Yes."
That
So she come,
co-regulation.
yes,
Yeah,
but she starts at attunement.
yeah.
She's because it's
And
not
her
hard for
own,
her because she feels terrible. The baby
yeah,
feels terrible, and so does she.
yeah, because she becomes more uncontained or
She
more
does.
dysregulated. As the baby goes up, she has a similar, and yeah,
Yes.
and it's like, ah, and
Yep.
then they
And
both
the baby
come,
goes whoop straight back. As soon
yeah,
as mum
yeah,
sounds
yeah,
herself distressed, baby goes whoosh. It's
yes.
before she even goes into that happy bit.
And their bodies are having this dance of attunement and this
Mm.
relief almost. I always think of it as she's relieved to be able to get out of that still face and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Isn't that
Well,
interesting? We both used that,
yeah.
and had similar things that we see, because that's not what they were studying baby sociability.
Mm.
But, whatever lens you're looking at it through, you might see and have different ways of understanding what's happening there. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I like looking at theories and coming up with a different theory about the
You see?
theory. And
Well, we all have them, right? Like you
yeah,
go,
yeah.
and people who are atheoretical, they still have theories about like what this child needs a swift kick up the backside.
Mhm.
That is their working theory. They might not be aware of it, but we all have them.
Yeah.
Yeah, we might as well get better and better at good ones and using them. Yeah.
It took us a while to talk about containment theory, and people that know you might think, well, that you did well there, but we didn't talk about attachment, and people might think that's remarkable of me in the circumstances. Um, I'll leave you with this.
Okay.
There's a prologue to each of my editions of the attachment books. There's only two editions, but the first one, it's a tale of three mice. The second one,
Okay.
it's a tale of four mice.
Okay.
And they're both attachment stories, but they're both Skinner's operant conditioning paradigm. And I've been waiting for someone to take me to task for the last 15 years or 16 years. But Because our children are very much like the intermittently reinforced rats in Skinner's experiment. So anyway, I'll
Okay.
leave it with you to have a bit of a look at what I'm talking about. But again, everyone, looked at Skinner's work and it was all about, consistent reinforcement and, and optimal for learning. And I looked at it and thought, no, I want to know about those kids that couldn't rely on
Yeah.
those
And that
rats
was
that
more
couldn't rely on the
powerful.
rat. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
That was a more powerful
that
form of
is.
conditioning from memory was the inconsistent.
Yep.
Um,
Yep. That's like our
yeah.
kids. It's like our kids. Yeah. Anyway,
Yeah.
it was lovely to speak to you. Let's do it
You as
again
well. That was great fun.
another
And
time.
yep, I'm happy to follow up with some of those things we talked about and connect you with Ruth maybe.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. Yeah, send me the names, please.
Okay. All
Okay.
right. Take
Thank
care.
you. Bye-bye.
Bye.